When it comes to making shapes in Cinema 4D, one of the most popular and probably the most well documented thing about Cinema 4D is using splines to create a shape outline and then putting them in an extrude object, which effectively gives you a 3D version of your shape. Now, one of the reasons this might be so popular is because a lot of people coming to C4D had a background in Illustrator and were very comfortable using the pen tool to create shapes. And obviously these skills transfer very well to the spline tools in Cinema. Now, in the vast majority of cases, if you want to keep this shape simple, this technique works really, really well. The problems come when you want to try and deform these kind of shapes or expand them with extra geometry or extra features. One drawback of this technique is this shape really can't go any further than just being a flat 3D representation of this shape. And the main reason for this is because the topology that's created by the extrude object is pretty hideous. By default, the extrude object is set to n-gons, which means this cap surface here is one giant n-gon. It has no supportive geometry inside it, and if you were to subdivide this, it would immediately collapse into this nightmare. So what you end up doing is playing the regular grid game, and I'm sure we're all familiar with this one. So currently, if I were to turn this into an editable object just by hitting C, we can see the kind of n-gon topology created on this surface. We have all these n-gon lines. The whole thing is triangulated. Where this spline was set to adaptive, these sharp curves here have a lot more detail, so these n-gon triangles are very bunched up here. And in the middle here we have this wide open space with this huge triangle polygon. Now if you try to deform this, these areas will bend, but they will only bend in the direction of these n-gon lines. This area here won't budge at all, and the whole thing will just collapse into a big mess. So the accepted way of resolving this is to turn your cap type to quadrangles. Again, if I subdivide this, you can see we get this kind of weird sort of crab hand kind of shape. And then we change this to the regular grid. Now we get our form back, but what happens is the edges along this shape are really hideous. And this is where the regular grid is having a hard time resolving the edge count on this surface with the edge count on the extrude. And as a result of this, we get this really hideous triangulated or n-gon topology again around the outside. So what you do is then continue with the game of trying to set this to uniform, and then kind of making the regular grid match the spacing of these edges. And after many hours of banging your head on the wall, you will eventually come to realise that this will never work, ever. So to get rid of all this junk round the outside, you end up adding a bunch of fillet caps in an attempt to move all this rubbish inwards and create a curve on your object. But even then, when you subdivide, this rubbish is still going to exist, and it's still going to create lumps and bumps. And this is simply because the subdivision surface generator does not like this kind of topology. It wants to see edge flow, it wants to see good quad topology in order for it to smooth properly. So you keep going, you keep jacking up the resolution, but there are some things you will still never get rid of, as the subdivision surface is freaking out. Now on the whole, this kind of technique does allow you to deform objects like this. Obviously, you know, put this in a twist and it will deform. And this is simply because you've added so much geometry to it. You know, that's a pretty dense mesh to start with. You may even have to add more subdivisions to the edges here. And this is what is allowing this mesh to deform. All you're really doing with the subdivision is adding even more geometry to it. Now, in some circumstances, you know, some shapes will cause like really bad ripping and tearing. So there has to be another way to do this, and there is. Here is the same shape, but this time it's made with topology. If we view our Gerudo shading lines here, you can see the subdivision surface, and you can see that the edges are nice and smooth. We have this edge flow going around. If I come to my twist deformer, and Gerudo shading, let's just turn that off. You can see that this object deforms perfectly. I could go to the rotation of my twist, you know, and do the twist on various angles, and you can see that this is a very sturdy piece of geometry. So if we have a look at the mesh, this is what is generating this shape. Now this mesh might look complicated, but I can assure you that it's actually very simple to manufacture. And all the detail you're seeing here is actually the result of baking down a single subdivision on top of some very simple geometry. And I've done this to give this mesh more flexibility when it comes to deformation. And I'm hoping that once you kind of understand the concept behind this, you'll have a lot more confidence in actually building these kind of abstract, you know, or motion graphics kind of shapes in regular geometry instead of using the spline. So how does this work? Well, let me show you. So on my screen I have a simple rectangle spline, and each edge is subdivided into two sections. Now the reason that this spline has these sharp corners on is that the spline type is set to linear, so we have this hard interpolation on the corners. Now if I turn the type of spline to B-spline, you can see that we get this rounding on our corners. And this is because the B-spline is interpolating a curve between this point here and this point here. And it's doing it via this control point. And this point is still situated where it was when the spline was set to linear. And the way we manipulate B-splines is to grab these points and move them around to change the curve. And the B-spline is very good at creating these kind of curvy shapes. So here I have a simple plane divided into 4 quads, and this means that each edge is divided into 2 sections. So you could say that this plane has the same topology as our spline. It has the same amount of outside points on it. So this is kind of the identical equivalent in geometry to our spline. Now, if I add this plane to a subdivision surface, we can see that we get a very similar result to when we changed our linear spline to B-spline, in the fact that now we have a curve happening on all of our corners. So if I select the geometry under the subdivision, you can see that the shape of the underlying geometry hasn't changed. And what's happening here is the subdivision is interpolating a curve between this point here and this point here. And it's doing this via this control point. Now, this underlying geometry is usually called the control cage because this is what you manipulate to change the curvature on your subdivision. And indeed, if I move this point, you can see that it behaves exactly the same way as the B-spline. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can manipulate the shape of the subdivision. At the moment, I'm seeing the control cage, but if I go to my view settings and choose isoline editing, you can see that the point is now moved to the edge of the subdivision surface. And I can easily grab that point. You'll notice, though, that where my mouse is the actual position of the control cage point. So you can work either way when doing this. I will say this, though, that sometimes using isoline editing can be a bit deceiving, especially when it comes to sharpening subdivisions and inner extruding. But I will explain all that a bit later on. So I'm going to go back to viewing my regular geometry. And I'm going to go back to my rectangle spline, and I'm just going to move some of these points sort of around like this, just to create some sort of organic shape. Now, because the topology of our geometry is the same as our spline, and the fact that the subdivision surface acts in a very similar way to the B-spline, we should be able to get this shape just by moving the control points on the outside edge of our geometry. So let's give that a go. Now, the curve interpolation is slightly different on the subdivision, so you need to do a little bit of extra tweaking, but not much. And you can see that when I click off, I've managed to replicate this shape perfectly with the subdivision. Now, you might also notice that what I get from the subdivision for free is a regular grid. Because we're dividing these 4 quads with a subdivision with 2 iterations, I now have effectively 16 quads on my subdivision surface instead of 4 on my regular geometry. Now, this regular grid aspect is the major advantage of doing it this way. And it should stand to reason that if I can make this shape by mimicking the B-spline, then I should be able to make any shape that you can make with a spline with just regular geometry and a subdivision. And indeed, you would be 100% correct for thinking that. There is nothing you can do with a spline that you can't do with geometry. And because you're using geometry, you have ultimate control over the topology of your shape. So when it comes to adding detail in, you can essentially model any shape out of this surface. Obviously, the more detail you want, the more topology you need. And this is pretty much what we're going to be learning over the course of the next 2 chapters. How do we manipulate geometry under subdivision to create any shape or surface we want? Now, you might ask, what about sharp corners? Obviously, splines can have hard interpolation on their corners. Well, when we're making these kind of surfaces and creating shapes for subdivisions, we can use subdivision weighting on points. If I were to select a point hit the period key and drag, you can see I can easily turn this point into a sharp corner. The same way I could do this with a Bezier curve, going between hard and soft interpolation on the spline. So using geometry and point weighting, we can pretty much create any 2D shape we want. So if you're familiar with splines, you're going to pick this up really easily, because what you're essentially doing is using the outside points in your geometry the same way as you would use points on a spline to make shapes. And this is the underlying technique in creating curvature in subdivisions. So let's move on to our next video where we'll discuss curvature in a bit more depth.